Childhood emotional neglect, often shortened to CEN, is not about what a parent did to a child. It is about what they didn't do. Specifically, an ongoing failure to notice, respond to, and validate a child's emotional world, even while physical needs like food, shelter, and safety are met adequately or well. The term was popularized by clinical psychologist Dr. Janice Webb, who described CEN as an invisible force in a person's life, one that is remarkably difficult to see precisely because it consists of gaps rather than events. This distinguishes CEN sharply from more commonly recognized forms of childhood adversity. Physical abuse, verbal abuse, and abandonment all involve something happening. A memory to point to, a scene that can be described and dated. Emotional neglect, by contrast, is cumulative and diffuse. Hundreds or thousands of small moments where a child's feelings went unacknowledged, where questions about their inner world simply weren't asked, where distress was met with silence, minimization, or mild irritation rather than attunement. No single instance looks damaging in isolation. It's the pattern, repeated across years, that produces the impact. Research on attachment and child development consistently shows that a child's emotional development depends on what developmental psychologists call contingent responsiveness. A caregiver noticing an emotional signal and responding to it in a way that helps the child understand and regulate what they're feeling. When this responsiveness is largely absent, children don't fail to develop feelings. They fail to develop the scaffolding for understanding, naming, and managing those feelings, which is a very different and much longer-lasting problem. Neglect is culturally understood as dramatic, a child left unsupervised, unfed, or unsafe. Emotional neglect usually involves none of those visible markers. A parent can provide consistently for every physical need, show up to school events, say, "I love you" regularly, and still lack the emotional capacity to attune to a child's inner life, to notice sadness building before it becomes a meltdown, to ask a genuine question and sit with the answer rather than move past it quickly. This is frequently, though not always, generational. A parent who was themselves emotionally neglected as a child typically never had the experience of being attuned to modeled for them, and so never developed the skill themselves, not from indifference, but from a genuine absence in their own emotional education. This is one of the most important and most difficult things to hold about CEN. It is very rarely a story of malice. It is far more often a story of a skill nobody in the family line has yet had the chance to learn. Because CEN leaves no single event to identify, it is also invisible to the person who experienced it. Many people spend decades assuming their childhood was basically fine, since nothing bad technically happened, and interpret their adult struggles as personal failings rather than the predictable downstream effects of an unmet developmental need. Recognizing CEN typically requires a shift in framing, from asking, "What happened to me?" to asking, "What didn't happen that should have?" Because there is no dramatic memory to recall, many people with a history of CEN report strangely flat, hazy, or thin memories of childhood. Not repressed in the classic trauma sense, but genuinely under-encoded, because memory tends to record events, and emotional neglect is precisely the absence of certain kinds of events. This absence of vivid memory is not evidence that nothing happened. Research on implicit memory shows the nervous system retains the emotional and physiological patterns of an environment, even when explicit, narratable memories of it are sparse. Common downstream effects that show up in adulthood, often decades after the childhood environment itself has ended, include chronic difficulty identifying and naming emotions, sometimes formally described as alexithymia, discomfort or even distress in response to praise and positive attention, persistent guilt around rest or leisure, a tendency to feel fundamentally undeserving of help or support, and a generalized sense of being subtly different or defective compared to other people, without a specific cause to point to. These are not character flaws, and they are not signs of weakness. They are the logical, learnable, and reversible consequences of a nervous system that adapted to an environment where certain emotional needs were not reliably met. Adaptations that made complete sense at the time and simply haven't yet been updated for a different, more supportive present. This point deserves to be stated with real clarity. Identifying childhood emotional neglect in your own history is not the same as declaring your parents to be villains, and it does not require rewriting your entire relationship with them into one of resentment. Most parents who neglect their children's emotional needs are themselves operating from unresolved wounds, limited emotional education, undiagnosed mental health conditions, chronic stress, or simply never having witnessed attuned parenting modeled in their own upbringing. Understanding this context does not erase or minimize the real impact CEN has had on you. Your experience and the difficulties that followed from it remain entirely valid, regardless of your parents' intentions or circumstances. But holding both truths together, that the impact on you is real and that the cause was very likely an inherited limitation rather than deliberate harm, tends to open a more useful path forward than anger alone can provide. One that leads toward understanding the pattern clearly enough to interrupt it, in yourself, for good. This reframe also matters practically. People who remain stuck in a purely blame-oriented understanding of their CEN often find it harder to do the actual work of healing, because so much energy goes into relitigating the past rather than building new patterns in the present. Compassion for your parents' likely limitations and full acknowledgement of what you needed and didn't get are not mutually exclusive. In fact, holding both is usually what allows healing work to actually begin. Left unnamed and unaddressed, childhood emotional neglect tends to quietly author large parts of adult life. In relationships, it commonly produces a pattern of giving far more than is received, because giving was always the more reliable route to feeling valuable, and receiving never felt entirely safe. In careers, it often manifests as achievement-driven identity, a persistent need to accomplish and produce, because usefulness was the currency of worth that was actually available growing up, rather than being loved simply for existing. It frequently produces discomfort with rest, with being cared for, and with being genuinely seen by another person, because none of those experiences were modeled as safe or reliable in the original environment. None of this reflects a character defect. Each pattern is a logical continuation of a childhood where consistent emotional attunement was not modeled often enough for a child to internalize it as a baseline expectation for how relationships and self-worth are supposed to work. The research on adult attachment and emotional regulation is consistent on one encouraging point. These patterns, because they were learned through repetition, can also be substantially rewritten through repetition. A different, more supportive kind, practiced deliberately and consistently over time. This is the premise the rest of this week's series builds on. This video has focused on definition and recognition, what CEN is, why it is so commonly missed, and why holding compassion for imperfect parents doesn't require dismissing your own real experience. The remaining 2 long-form videos this week build directly on this foundation. On Wednesday, we look closely at exactly how childhood emotional neglect quietly runs adult relationships, the specific patterns in who you're drawn to, how you give and receive, and why intimacy itself can feel destabilizing, even with genuinely safe people. On Friday, we closed the series by moving from understanding into practice. Concrete, evidence-informed steps for reparenting yourself and building the emotional skills that didn't get modeled the first time around. If anything in this video has resonated, that reaction is itself meaningful information, and it's worth trusting rather than dismissing. Recognition is always the necessary first step in any process of change. You cannot repair a pattern you have not yet been able to name. This week, on Healing Through Thoughts, we're giving that pattern its name, in full, and then getting to work on it together.